He's spent his life documenting those who live in some of the world's most notorious conflict zones.
I want to make a difference. I want my photographs to create change. Giles Dooley, photographer and CEO of Legacy of War Foundation.
Being blown up in Afghanistan put him on a path to making sure the voiceless are heard.
I don't want to be an inspiration. I just want to be an example. Children, maybe that are injured, other people that have lost limbs. If they can see me living the full life that I do, I don't mind being an inspiration to them.
So your career as a photographer, then, Giles, has catapulted you into, you're meeting the great and the good of the world, celebrities. It could have been different, couldn't it? But you started out as a boxer, I think.
Yeah, I was 18. I went to America on a sports scholarship, and I was involved in a minor car accident. But at that point, sport was my life, and I'm told you're never going to do sport again. And I was such an angry man. I was so, everything had been taken away from me. And then 2 small gifts changed my life forever. My godfather, unfortunately, passed away, and his widow brought these 2 things he'd bought the week he died. And one was an Olympus OM10 camera, and another was a book by the war photographer Don Cullen. And seeing these photographs for the first time just took my breath away, and I knew there and then that's what I wanted to do. I left hospital full of good intentions to go and do this war photography, but I had some friends that were musicians and in bands, and that just took off, and suddenly I'm getting magazines calling me. I'm flying around the world to photograph Mariah Carey, Oasis, Lenny Kravitz, all these amazing artists.
And how did you go from Mariah Carey and Lenny Kravitz and Oasis to some of the work that we can see here today?
Yeah, it was a slow transition. I loved it. I was probably 28 years old and doing a photo shoot of Lenny Kravitz in his house in Miami, getting paid a ridiculous amount of money really for what I was doing, and sitting in my hotel room, and I cried, and I remember just feeling completely empty. And I thought, well, if I have all the success, I'm living the dream, and I still feel empty, what's wrong? What will fill that void? Probably 6 months later, I was doing a photo shoot in London at the Charlotte Street Hotel, and it really came to a climax. And in the middle of this shoot, there was a young actress, and she was in tears because her agent was saying, you shouldn't have your top on. The editor of the magazine was arguing with her, and it was just crazy. And I sat there, and I went, this is not why I became a photographer. And then I remembered those 2 small gifts that I mentioned, the Olympus OM10 camera and the book by Don Cullen, and how they'd made me feel when I was given those at 18. And I realized that's where I'd gone wrong. I hadn't used my photography to tell stories. So that's what I decided I had to do. I was going to find my purpose. It would be to use my camera to tell the stories of others.
And then fast forward to that fateful day in Afghanistan, where you stepped on the IED.
I was on patrol with American troops. We were ambushed. As we ran for cover, I stepped on an improvised explosive device, an IED. I was thrown in the air. I didn't lose my consciousness. I landed on my side. I could see both my legs had gone, my arm, and really thought those were the last moments of my life. And just try to imagine this for a moment. I woke up. I'm in an intensive care unit. So the lights are on. People are running around. There's bleeps, alarms going off. You're panicked. Where am I? I didn't even know which country I was in. And I tried to scream, but I had tubes down into my neck and my throat. I tried to sit up and realized I was strapped to the bed. And what I very quickly realized is the only bodily function I had any control over was blinking. The hard part was probably 3 months after the injury. I was well enough. I'd been moved to what's called high dependency unit. So I'm still pretty sick. It was the first time they were able to move me from a bed into a wheelchair to have a shower. And that was the first time I saw myself in a mirror. It was the first time I realized I probably wasn't going to die, but I now had to come to terms with my new reality. I was told I'd never walk again. I would never live independently. There was no question of me ever working as a photographer again. Everything was gone. At that stage, I still couldn't even feed myself. My hand was so badly damaged. So, I was being fed. I couldn't go to the toilet on my own. That seemed like it was going to be my future. And seeing myself in the mirror, I was kind of disgusted. Missing limbs, scars across my body. And I remember when they put me back in the bed, I cried myself to sleep. And I thought, I wish actually I'd just died in Afghanistan because I was not brave enough or strong enough to deal with this new reality. Because it's hard to explain when everything's taken away from you, all your independence. I woke up the next day and I said, I will never think about the things I can't do, but I'll focus on what I can, and I will excel at those. And that managed to change my life completely, not just my recovery, but my work, the NGO that I run, everything I do in my life.
Can you tell us a bit about what you're doing here with the Wish Foundation and how that all fits together?
I want to make a difference. I want my photographs to create change. I'm not just doing it because I want to create photographs that people look at and go, wow, it's amazing. I want people to look at them and take action. This gives me the opportunity to tell stories. As a documentarian, as a storyteller, I have tried to show that wars are all the same, sadly. The stories are just the same.
Giles, despite the 37 operations and everything that you've been through, you remain a photographer. Do you think there was ever a time when people may have written you off?
I can understand why some people would do that, but anybody that knows me knows how stubborn I am. Photography for me was who I am, it's my identity. So it wasn't even just really about returning to work. It was the fact that if I could make photographs again, I would have my life back. So no, I don't think anyone actually wrote me off. I'm sure people who didn't know me would think, how's a guy, triple amputee, going to possibly return to traveling around the world working as a photographer? Even holding the cameras. But as I say, the people close to me, they never doubted it.
You contribute in lots of different ways, running around the world doing all sorts of projects, but the Legacy War Foundation is a big part of what you do. It's a big passion of yours, isn't it? Can you tell us a bit about that?
I never really planned to set up an NGO, but 25 years now of working with NGOs around the world, I saw maybe, not their faults because they do amazing work, but I saw gaps in things that we could do. And so I wanted to create an organization that worked very differently. The way we work is differently, and probably easiest to explain through an example, and that's Land for Women, a project in Rwanda, where we set up cooperative farms for genocide survivors. And the women on these farms, we bought the land and gave it to them. So they became the landowners, which changed the power dynamic, because now they choose to work with us. But the Legacy of War Foundation is something that is changing lives, and changing lives in a permanent way.
Many people across the world enjoyed your One-Armed Chef series, and the connection between photography and food may not be obvious to some people, but it's one that is important to you, isn't it?
I've seen the worst in humanity, and I think psychologically, obviously, that takes an impact. And then one day I realized that actually food is the opposite. Where war destroys, it breaks communities apart, it's how we express hatred. Food is how we build communities. It's how we bring people together, and it's how we express love. So I have a rule that I won't photograph anyone if I haven't eaten with them first.
I think, Giles, because of the way you've responded to what's happened to you, many people all over the world will see you as an inspirational figure.
Yeah, I'm certainly not comfortable with the idea of being inspirational. I was just in Ukraine a week ago, and I was visiting hospitals where children have been injured. And I think for them to be able to see somebody who's lost 3 limbs, able to live a full life, I'm living the best life. I don't mind it being an inspiration to them. I think that's the thing, is like if it's somebody else injured, somebody else goes through the same thing, I'm happy to be an inspiration to them, but I don't want to be an inspiration to an everyday person because all I am doing is just living my normal life. And I've always said, as a photographer, I hope, when I'm gone, I'll be forgotten, but my photographs are remembered.
Well, I think that's self-evident. Giles, thanks so much for joining us on the dialogue.
Pleasure.
Incredibile giornata conclusiva del Tel Aviv Grand Slam. Il sole tramonta su un'altra competizione di judo di successo in Israele. Grande festa nei più 78 kg con Raz Hershko, che ha dato spettacolo nei preliminari. Non aveva mai vinto un oro in patria, è stata la sua prima volta e ha festeggiato con la nuova generazione di judoka israeliani. L'ambasciatore dell'IGF Lioraz era lì per consegnarle la medaglia d'oro. Wow, è stato incredibile, mi piace gareggiare in casa con tutto questo pubblico fantastico, pazzesco, dall'inizio fino alla fine gridano, ti sostengono ed è fantastico. Categoria meno 90 kg, gli amici e rivali Beniashvili e Tot si sono abbracciati prima dell'incontro, prima che il georgiano continuasse a dominare la scena, mostrando ancora una volta dopo la gara il loro rispetto reciproco. Moris Janashvili, ospite di IGF, ha consegnato le medaglie. A meno 78 kg Alice Bellandi ha vinto ancora una volta l'oro, conquistando la sua 4ª medaglia nel World Judo Tour in pochi mesi. Sta davvero dominando la sua categoria, premiata dal direttore sportivo IGF Vladimir Barta. Meno 100 kg Zelim Kostoyev ha affrontato il campione del Grande Slam di Parigi di 2 settimane fa, Michael Corel, e lo ha superato con questo brillante pezzo di judo. È stato premiato dalla direttrice degli eventi dell'IGF, Lisa Allan. Mi piace combattere qui in Israele, c'è un'atmosfera fantastica con tanti bambini che fanno il tifo, la gente qui ama molto il judo, è davvero energizzante. Nei più 100 kg il mongolo Odku Tsetsetsengel ha portato a 3 gli ori del Grande Slam con una combattuta vittoria sull'Azero Kokwari e è stato premiato dalla direttore degli arbitri dell'IGF Florin Daniel Lascau. Giornata da ricordare per il pubblico di casa che si è scatenato per i suoi eroi dall'inizio alla fine. Dopo una delle gare più belle della giornata, Peter Paltnik ha fatto alzare tutti in piedi, anche se ha concluso la giornata senza medaglie. Incarna l'energia e l'eccitazione per il futuro del judo israeliano.
La prossima edizione del notiziario tra meno di un minuto su Euronews.
Si estraggono ancora persone vive fra le macerie del terremoto che ha colpito Siria e Turchia, ma il numero delle vittime ha superato quota 46.000. Alla conferenza per la sicurezza di Monaco di Baviera, i partner occidentali si ripromettono di raddoppiare gli sforzi per aiutare l'Ucraina contro l'aggressione russa. Continuano a verificarsi miracoli in Turchia nei luoghi scossi dal terribile terremoto. Nonostante alcuni sopravvissuti estratti vivi dalle macerie, però, il numero delle vittime continua ad aumentare. Le cifre parlano di una delle più terribili catastrofi naturali della storia moderna. Oltre 46.000 persone sono state uccise e si prevede che il bilancio aumenterà vertiginosamente, visto che sono circa 345.000 gli appartamenti distrutti. Molte persone sono ancora disperse. Crescono anche le preoccupazioni per le vittime della tragedia in Siria, con il programma alimentare mondiale che fa pressioni sulle autorità del nord-ovest del paese affinché smettano di impedire l'accesso all'area mentre si cerca di aiutare centinaia di migliaia di persone. Il capo dell'autorità turca per la gestione dei disastri e delle emergenze ha affermato che gli sforzi di ricerca e soccorso termineranno in gran parte domenica notte. L'Unione Europea promette di raddoppiare l'aiuto all'Ucraina contro l'aggressione russa. È quello che chiedono gli alleati alla conferenza sulla sicurezza di Monaco di Baviera. Capofila delle richieste è la Presidente della Commissione europea, Ursula von der Leyen.
I think it's now the time really to speed up the production and to scale up the production of standardized products that Ukraine needs desperately. For example, the standardized ammunition. It cannot be that we have to wait months and years till we are able to replenish or till we are able to deliver that to Ukraine.
Anche la vicepresidente statunitense Kamala Harris ha parlato dell'importanza del sostegno a Kiev contro la barbarie e ricordato i crimini contro l'umanità commessi dalla Russia sul suolo ucraino. Rita di manifestazioni, come sempre accade in occasione di grandi eventi, di fronte all'hotel di Monaco di Baviera in Germania, dove si sta tenendo la conferenza sulla sicurezza. Manifestanti anti-NATO, pacifisti di varie estrazioni o manifestanti pro-curdi che gridano i loro slogan contro il presidente turco Recep Tayyip Erdogan si sono radunati in strada. Nessun manifestante pro-russo, ma le organizzazioni ucraine non hanno mancato di far sentire la loro presenza per mettere all'indice il comportamento illegale di Mosca e i crimini commessi dal governo di Vladimir Putin. La Corea del Nord ha lanciato un missile balistico intercontinentale. L'ordigno ha volato per 66 minuti ed è atterrato nel Mar del Giappone. Venerdì il regime di Kim Jong-un ha minacciato di scatenare una rappresaglia in caso di esercitazioni militari tra Corea del Sud e Stati Uniti. Le esercitazioni primaverili, che dovrebbero iniziare il mese prossimo, sono progettate per aiutare a respingere le crescenti minacce nucleari della Corea del Nord, ma Pyongyang insiste da tempo che si tratti soltanto di prove in vista dell'invasione del paese. 6 persone sono state uccise a colpi di arma da fuoco nella città di Arcabutla, nel Mississippi, secondo lo sceriffo della contea. I funzionari dicono che l'assassino è entrato in un negozio ed ha sparato a un uomo prima di spostarsi in 2 case della zona e fare altre vittime. L'assassino ha ucciso fra gli altri la sua ex moglie e ferito l'attuale marito. È il 73esimo crimine di questo genere negli USA dall'inizio dell'anno.
Declaro o Carnaval da Democrazia, o Carnaval do Rio de Janeiro aberto.
Il carnevale più famoso del mondo, quello di Rio de Janeiro in Brasile, è iniziato venerdì con il sindaco Eduardo Paes, che come da cerimoniale ha consegnato le chiavi della città a Re Momo, aprendo il primo vero carnevale dal 2020, dopo 2 edizioni ridotte e posticipate dalla pandemia. Quest'anno il governo federale del Brasile, tra Rio, San Paolo e altre città, si aspetta che 46 milioni di persone partecipino al carnevale, in programma un po' ovunque fino al 22 febbraio.
Il politologo bulgaro Ivan Krastev risponde alle nostre domande questo lunedì in The Global Conversation.
Young people only think about playing video games to raise money.
Young people only think about becoming influencers for new callings.
Je peux sortir ce soir, s'il te plaît.
Young people only think about being free
S'il te plaît, c'est une forme de politesse.
from an individualistic society. Young people only think about hanging outside to save lives.
Times are changing, and so is commitment.
Hello and welcome to Bruxelles Je t'aime, Euronews' talk show all about the European capital of Brussels. On Brussels, my love, we break down some of the big stories of the week, examine what's at stake for you and for Europe. My name is Maeve McMahon. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up this week, the EU looks set to narrowly escape a recession this year. That's according to new data from the European Commission. Despite that glimmer of hope, the cost of living is still getting more and more expensive, and many households are still paying massive utility bills and petrol prices. Whether it's a pound of butter, a pizza takeaway, a cappuccino or a night away, we're asking how long more we have to put up with this shrinkflation and what can be done to address it. And greening all our homes by 2050. The European Parliament has voted on the so-called EU Buildings Directive, which aims to have all EU buildings and homes climate neutral and energy efficient by 2050. Sounds great. And who doesn't want to have an eco-friendly, energy-efficient home? But as it stands, the onus is on homeowners, and each EU member state has a mixed bag. So we're asking if the green renovation wave is a utopia or a reality. To talk about these topics and much more, I'm joined here in our studio by Monique Goyen, the Secretary-General of BEUC. That's, of course, the European Consumer Organisation. We're also joined by Daniel Kroes, the German economist and the Director of the Centre for European Policy Studies, and also Silvia Ganzela, the Policy Director at Eurocities. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. And before we hear your thoughts and your insights, let's just remind our viewers what's at stake. Christopher Pitchers reports.
Bills, bread, butter. You name it, the price of everything is up. And for now, it's not coming down. The global pandemic, the climate crisis, and now the war in Ukraine have all created a perfect storm when it comes to the cost of everything we consume or purchase in our daily lives. But there is some good news. The European Commission's most recent projections for this year show that inflation is falling and is predicted to drop even further in 2024. The full impact of consecutive interest rate hikes supposed to restrain demand in order to cool inflation have also not been felt yet. For now, though, price increases remain stubbornly high. And as this cost of living crisis continues, the main concern of many people will be if it is really becoming too expensive to live.
Christopher Pitcher's there, so I'll address that question to all of you, to our panel. Has the cost of living here in Europe gotten too expensive? Daniel Gross, if you wouldn't mind starting, because you are economists here around the table, and you've been, I think, very involved as well when the euro was created. You've been writing a lot of books as well about inflation and what it means for us.
We are unfortunately in a situation where there's very little we can do, we in Europe, to break the spiral of an increasing cost of living. And the main reason is it comes from abroad. It comes from higher energy and more material prices. And there we are now in a situation where things are pretty bad still, but getting better. The price of petrol coming down a little bit from the heights which we have seen last summer. And that's already useful for those who have a car and drive a lot. But it's still at a high level. And the same applies a bit to natural gas, which is essential for us to keep our homes warm and generate electricity. And there again, we have seen extraordinary prices last summer, 20 times higher than the past. And now they have coming down, but they're still 3 or 4 times higher than the past. So it's getting slowly better, but it's still pretty bad.
Okay, so in a nutshell, it's bad, but it's getting slowly better. In just a minute, we'll come to that spring economic forecast that the European Commission presented earlier this week. But first, let's get the take from the consumer organisation here, from Monique Goyens, what you're seeing.
Yeah. First of all, it is really important to note that this is not a cost of living crisis that hits marginal segments of the population. It's really hitting a very important mass of people who have decent jobs, families with 2 salaries that are being hit by this cost of living crisis. And it is true that we see that the inflation rate might go down. However, this is not the end of the crisis, because this is not a single crisis we are going through. We are going through a multi-crisis. And the next crisis to come is the climate, it's already there, but that will hit us even more if we don't act, is the climate change crisis. And therefore, we really need our governments to address the cost of living crisis in a visionary, smart way, by addressing also at the same time the climate change crisis. And that's a challenge that we really expect governments to take up in the coming months and weeks and years.
And caught in the middle, of course, of national governments are the cities from across Europe. And you're from Eurocities, representing 200 cities from across the continent. How are you foreseeing the situation now? Has it just gotten too expensive to live?
Well, definitely, it has been gone very expensive. We see rising, worrying trends of prices going up. It's about food, it's about energy, bills, cost of housing, transport, access to services. And at the moment, people that were vulnerable are becoming even more vulnerable, and the middle class is becoming vulnerable. So it's nice to see that there are some more positive outlooks for the economy, but the question is this going to trickle down to the people? And we are now putting in place some short-term measures, but we should think about more long-term measure to tackle the crisis. Because at the moment what we're seeing is the middle class that is becoming poor. We have a new number of people, raising number of people that we can define working poor. So we had the shock of the COVID pandemic, which put at risk many people with precarious contracts, and they're still paying from that crisis. And then the invasion of Ukraine just exacerbated everything.
Okay, so
absolutely, yeah, because it's not only the inflation, it's also what is very important is to check how markets are behaving, because there are a lot of price increases that have no justification. And this is something where we believe governments should, or authorities should enforce with teeth. They should really tackle unfair marketing practices. There are some of the food price increases that are not at all justified by the inflation.
Well, this is why we're talking about this concept of shrinkflation. I was reading an article earlier this week about inflation in Poland, which is huge, and people are going to the supermarket, according to this article, with a magnifying glass to make sure that there's 10 tissues in the box of tissues they're buying and not 8, because seemingly consumers are being tricked in the last couple of months due to this crisis. Is this something you've noted, Daniel Gross? Shrinkflation?
Not really yet at a large scale. I think it is true that whenever we have high price increases, some not very scrupulous producers try to trick consumers by changing slightly the amount of the good they put into a package and so on. But overall, there's just no escape. When inflation, when energy prices go up and other raw material prices go up that we have to import, there's less to be distributed overall for our entire economy. So when governments promise nobody will suffer, that's wrong, because somebody has to pay the price. Now, a good government would make sure that the better off pay more, and those at the bottom are protected. That sounds easy to say and to ask for, but the difficulty lies in actually doing it and implementing it. Like, for example, the German government tried last year to say, okay, we will protect only consumers which have a moderate consumption and have low income. And then they turn to the electricity company and say, we don't have that information. We can't do it, right? So it takes some time to have smart policies in place.
And as Sylvia was saying earlier as well, politicians do not think long term. A quick comment from you, and then I want to talk about the Eurogroup that happened this week.
About the...
do you have a quick reaction there to what Daniel Gross was saying?
Well, yes, of course, it is true that in fact, you should be counterintuitive. You should discriminate as a government. You should really focus on helping the poorer households. All of us have received a voucher to pay our energy bill. We didn't need it. Bring that money to those who really need it. That's really important.
That's just a populist measure, right?
Yes, indeed. I mean, everybody, of course, we are all happy to get that money or to have this reduction of our energy bill, but we should really be able to help those who need it most. That's what fiscal justice is about.
Yeah. That's what fiscal justice is about. Sylvia?
Yeah, if I can mention something about the more long-term vision that we need to take, it's very clear that